I'd prepared an introduction of some distinction for a very distinguished presenter. But in consideration of our time, I'll give only an abbreviation of what I think is warranted. Only the small secrets need to be protected. The large ones are kept secret by public incredulity. Marshall McLuhan. The Gospel of Thomas includes the following. Jesus said, "Know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will be disclosed to you. For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and there is nothing buried that will not be raised." Our speaker is a former Army intelligence officer, an expert in Far Eastern studies, a scholar of Christian theology and comparative religions, an historian, an educator, and an author whose research has led to revelations about America's hidden histories. He is the author of 1992's JFK in Vietnam, 1995's Oswald and the CIA, which was updated for 2008 edition. And most recently, 2011's Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in the Light of Yogic Mysticism. I am personally honored to introduce Dr. John Newman, and he will introduce his assistant, Jay. Welcome, Dr. John Newman.
Are we live with the mic? Good. All right. I'm going to get started. I have a busy agenda here with you today.
Okay.
I just want to thank the AARC for inviting me to be here with you today, and to acknowledge my long friend and colleague, Jay Harvey, who has worked tirelessly in the archives and had been with me as a discussant for 20 years. Since JFK in Vietnam. Thank you, Jay, for being there. I could stand here at this podium and tell you what I prepared to say in the next hour in just 5 minutes instead. But there's a difference between saying that something is true and proving that it's true. Stating opinions about the CIA and its operatives is pretty easy to do. Proving what the facts are is much harder work. We must begin with an underlying base of facts and details. From this base, an evidentiary hierarchy must be built. Any overarching theory of the JFK case must be derived from such an evidentiary hierarchy. The investigation of the Kennedy assassination outside of Dealey Plaza is the same as it is inside Dealey Plaza. It's all a crime scene. The boxes of JFK records in the National Archives are still a crime scene. The source of each detail, like any evidence, must be accounted for, from crime scene to courtroom, or in this case, the big screens in front of you today. I ask that you bear with me with the technical aspects of my presentation. I'm going to try and move the chains down the football field a little bit today, so I'm going to have to work with you on the devil and the details. Some of the groundwork I will put in place today comes from the first and subsequent volumes of my forthcoming new works on the case, but the focus of my presentation today will be devoted to putting a fresh evidentiary base in place, a base that spans from the OSS in World War II to the CIA in the late 1960s. I plan to do that by unmasking a few of the CIA officers and operatives who were behind multiple identities that bear heavily upon the Kennedy assassination case. I will have something more to say about George Joannides and his boss, William Kent, expand a little bit perhaps on what you've heard so far this morning. Great presentation, by the way, just now. Fantastic. I will be dealing principally with David Phillips and someone who is probably known to most of you as Tony Sforza. Of these two names, only Phillips is a true name from birth. Actually, the middle birth name of the person using the name Tony Sforza was, in fact, Antonio. So let me pose this question. Why are the CIA's multiple identities important to this case? The answer is related to something Dan Hardway said to me the first time we met. Under many CIA operations, there's another operation in play. I refer to these as the CIA's dark operations. Peter Dale Scott gave us the term deep politics. The late Gary Webb gave us the term dark alliance. In my forthcoming works, I will use the terms dark operation, dark operations, or dark matter. The CIA uses pseudonyms when its operatives handle their sources. More importantly, they are used internally at the secret level. This internal use is imperative for CIA counterintelligence operations. It makes it very difficult for moles to piece together sensitive operations. It is the foundation of what is called compartmentalization in tradecraft and the need to know. Moreover, the CIA reinforces the use of multiple identities with carefully crafted deceptions in its secret cables and memos. These deceptions backstop and maintain the differentiation between the different identities that belong to the same person. In 3 secret cables I'll show you today, you'll be able to see how such deliberate deceptions are used to convince those reading these cables that there are 2 people in the story, when in fact, they are both the same person. I have come to the view that without unmasking the CIA's pseudonyms, cryptonyms, and multiple identities related to this case, in the end it will not be possible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt who was behind the assassination and how they got away with it. Jay? The pseudonyms and multiple identities I have chosen to work on with you today were inextricably woven into a CIA operation to defect and recruit Rolando Cabela, who eventually, with the support of the Kennedy brothers, would be used in an attempted operation to assassinate Fidel Castro. We will penetrate deep inside of the Cabela operation and identify who the people who managed it really were. From that base, we can continue to build the evidentiary hierarchy that will uncover the darkest operation that was put into play underneath of the Cabela operation. I don't believe there was ever a darker operation than this one. Its intent was to play the JFK-RFK plot to topple Castro back against the president and his brother. Its success depended on Castro being alive, not dead, after the Kennedy assassination. Castro, along with the Soviet Union, had to appear to be behind the president's murder with Oswald as the shooter. There was a CIA Oswald operation to embarrass the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Dan talked about it a little while ago. In foreign countries, that was in play in the fall of 1963. When you look at the Church Committee's report that describes it, its oblique and inadequate description betrays its true function as a top shelf cover operation under which something else was really going on. Running underneath that supposed Oswald FPCC operation was a dark op, intended to tie Oswald to the Soviets and the Cubans while he was in Mexico City. Whether he was there or somebody else matters less than tying the Oswald name to the Cubans and the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that. I dealt with the evidence for that part of the puzzle in the 2008 sequel to my book, Oswald and the CIA, so there's not time to go over that again today. In my presentation today, I will place the Cabela operation into the adjacent area of the same puzzle. The operation to kill the president was in play underneath both the Oswald op in Mexico and the Cabela op to assassinate Castro. However, it's important to note that the Cabela-Castro operation op had an important additional ingredient: the backing of the Kennedy brothers. In my presentation to you today, you're going to hear a lot about 4 Cubans, 3 of whom became best friends during childhood and whose destiny led them to create the Directorio Revolucionario, the DR, in order to overthrow the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. The group's leader was Jose Antonio Echevarria. The second childhood friend was Rolando Cabela. later assigned the CIA cryptonym Amlash, and is known for the assassination plot against Castro. And the third is Carlos Tepedino Gonzalez, later assigned the CIA crypt AMWIP, A-M-WIP. Jay, let's go to the next slide. Cuba has a history of student opposition to dictators. During the early 1930s, a splinter group of the Federation of University Students formed a secret organization to overthrow the Machado dictatorship. They called it the University Students Directorate. Next slide. It was in this tradition that in 1956, Antonio Echevarria formed the secret organization known as the DR at the University of Havana. Carlos Tepedino financed the group through the profits from his jewelry business, and Rolando Cabela became the DR's second in command. Next slide. To this group of three, I add a fourth Cuban. He was a jewel smuggler who, through family connections, opportunistically insinuated himself into this childhood threesome and their secret DR. His name was Francisco Wilfredo Pancho Varona Alonso, and he was assigned the CIA cryptonym AM Concert 1. To avoid confusing him with the famous Cuban leader Antonio Varona, with whom he was not related, today I'll refer to him simply as Pancho. Easy to remember. Next slide. The DR was active in Cuba before Castro's famous Gramont naval expedition landed in Orient province in November 1956. While Castro's 26 July group was on the run in the swamps and hills, Echevarria launched a bold attack on the presidential palace to assassinate Batista. Castro selfishly disparaged the DR and called them cowards for not putting support of his own group ahead of their plans to topple the regime. Castro was reportedly relieved when the plot failed. After Echevarria was gunned down on the streets, no new student leader appeared who could deal with Castro as an equal. The DR played a crucial role in the final 20 months of the revolution. And after Batista's flight, it was the DR that seized control of the presidential palace, and they refused to give it up to Castro's 26 July elements until given posts in the new provisional government. But then, at the last minute, the DR leader at the time, Far Chaumont, gave in to Castro. Cabela, however, was immediately alienated by Castro's move towards communism. Let's go to the next slide. A CIA man working with the CIA in Havana, who appears in the files with the pseudonym Andrew F. Merton, had been using Tepedino as an informant. Now Tepedino made arrangements to help Merton recruit Cabela. That attempt failed when Castro suddenly sent Cabela to Spain as Cuba's military attaché. Cabela reportedly told his closest friends that if he didn't get out of Cuba right away, he would kill Castro himself, a remark that quickly found its way to the CIA. Castro successfully isolated and split the DR, which then drifted into a void. Many of its members were assimilated into Castro's 26 July government. Yet many disenchanted DR members remained who saw Castro as just another dictator who was taking Cuba communist, and they organized clandestine opposition to his regime. Within 12 months, they fled to the United States as political refugees. There, they readopted the name Cuban Student Directorate, the DRE. The DRE was formed as a unilateral psychological warfare asset of the CIA station in Miami, JM Wave. In the summer of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald became publicly involved with the DRE's operations. The real person behind the Andrew F. Merton identity has been protected like Fort Knox for 50 years, even inside the CIA. If this identification was known to the JFK Records Review Board, they did not release it. They might not have known about it. I've seen no evidence that the House Select Committee knew about it either. Gaten Fonzie didn't write about it in his book, The Last Investigation. A lone 2008 posting on one obscure JFK website picked up the scent, but was thrown off the trail by an internal roadblock set up right after the assassination. The purpose of that roadblock was to decouple the man using the Merton pseudonym from his long history in the Cabela operation. I'll get to that again after proving who Merton was in this section of my presentation. But when this part of the puzzle is put together, it will allow us to solve much more of the puzzle, including the pseudonyms, nicknames, the true birth name, and the CIA cryptonym for the person using the name Tony Sforza. Besides appearing in Cuba from 1958 to 1960, Andrew Merton also appeared in the 1954 CIA-directed coup in Guatemala, and then he reappeared again in CIA operations in Mexico from 1961 to 1964. This is how you do it. You have to have life events to associate pseudonyms that are separated in the files. The Cuban experts out there know who this assignment profile belongs to. David Atlee Phillips. Next slide. Good. Among those good soldiers who fought fearlessly for the truth in this case, and to whom we are paying tribute at this conference, is Gaten Fonzie. He spent time in my basement going over some of my files. I remember him well, fondly. Gaten blazed a trail like none other to light the way to Phillips' involvement with Oswald. And we're blessed and fortunate to have Antonio Vesciani here this afternoon to tell that story for us. In the 2008 sequel to my Oswald book, I opined that CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton played an important role in the plot to murder President Kennedy. Now I want to stand with Gaten Fonzie and add my name to his and others who are convinced that the CIA's top psychological warfare officer, David Phillips, also played an important role. I'll begin to make that case today by sharing some work I've done for the last 3 years on the pseudonyms that belonged to David Phillips. By the way, for those Philip watchers out there among you, his first CIA crypt in Chile was a combination of the Chilean digraph, whatever that is, and Minotaur 1. I'd never seen an actual crypt for Phillips before until recently. Anyway, it's been widely known that Dave Phillips used the pseudonym Michael Choaden. The CIA has not protected that identification and has even released cables with the name Phillips handwritten in over the top of the name Choaden. Many of you have probably seen these. Phillips was Andrew Merton. He was also Jack Stewart, and he was behind more than a dozen other aliases as well. But the Andrew Merton, Jack Stewart identification is going to take us on a trail that begins with the DR, continues through the Joe and Edie's JM Wave DRE operation, through the Rolando Cabela Amlash operation, and all the way to and through the 1963 Oswald operation in New Orleans and Mexico City. This trail takes us across familiar parts of the puzzle. James Angleton's counterintelligence staff, William Harvey's foreign intelligence staff and his Task Force W, Cuban Ops, and Desmond Fitzgerald's Special Affairs staff, also Cuban Ops. This trail will also begin to shine a light on another hardly known staff element at the top of the CIA, the PP staff, the psychological and paramilitary operations staff at the top. Guess who came from there? Howard Hunt, David Phillips, and a whole lot of other people we know and love in this case. Hopefully, if I'm disciplined, we can get to the PP staff, and I'll show you some charts on that in the question and answer session if somebody will ask me to do it. To get there, however, we must be absolutely certain of each foothold along the way. We are working with a few people who appear to be many. It's the pseudonyms and cryptonyms that need to be broken to put this puzzle together. So, let me roll up my sleeves. I've already done that. Break out my stubby pencil. That's what we use in Army Intels. And our Guhor sticks, our net diagram sticks, and lay the evidentiary base for this part of the puzzle. Just leave that there. At this part of the presentation, we'll be working principally with 4 documents, a CIA Havana Station cable, a JM Wave cable, and 2 very critical FBI documents. As you look at these FBI memos, note the assignments of the person whose name the CIA still wants to be kept secret, first in Havana and later in Mexico City. These assignments match the assignment profile of Phillips. Let's get the next slide now. We'll get started with this CI Havana station cable. By the way, my methodology, I'm going to show you the doc. You can't read that. I'm going to blow it up in 70 font so that you can see it in the back row, and if you buy the DVD, it's going to be there for you. So it started with this one. Go ahead and the next slide. So the key, as you can see here, is the symbiotic, very close relationship between Phillips and Carlos Tepedino. After working together in Cuba, Phillips eventually wound up in Mexico City, where Tepedino also visited him. This excerpt from the cable shows just how closely Carlos trusted Phillips. When we get to the 1962 CI Cabela defection op, you will see that the agency played this "any friend of Merton" card again to get Tepedino's help to get to Cabela. Next slide. This one shows that Phillips recruited Tepedino around May 1958. Let's go to the next one. This is in a Miami, FBI Miami office, Airtel, and it's the first of two key mid-1962 FB documents that I mentioned a second ago. As we scroll down, page at a time, you'll notice in the margins there's CI requests to keep stuff secret in there. It's all CI, even though it's an FBI document. To this day, they don't want us to know what's inside those redactions. But the unredacted material is obviously the life story of Phillips. Next slide. Let's blow some stuff up. The redactor did not widen the redactions beyond the withheld words, a mistake that allows freaks like me to precisely count letters and spaces and fill in the blanks like playing the game Hangman. Let's do this one, in which Tepedino talks about his contact in Havana. It's got 13 space hole into which fits perfectly the name Dave Space Phillips. Let's go to the next one. This one mentions Phillips' transfer to Mexico City. It's also easy to solve. His name fits into the first hole perfectly. But Arthur Avignon was the CI deputy chief of station, and after Phillips left, would have been a logical choice to keep running Tepedino. Guess whose name fits into the second hole? Perfectly, Arthur Avignon. Let's go to the next one. This is the devil in the details, guys. This is what we got to do. This Hoover memo to the CIA is the second key FBI document I mentioned. It tells the same story that originated in the Miami Airtel. Again, as we scroll down one page through it, you'll see the CIA's per CI, meaning the CIA wants this stuff redacted. Again, the life story belongs to Phillips. Let's blow some of this stuff up. This one here, this part of it, is about Tepedino's CI Havana contact, and it's too easy. 13 spaces for Dave Phillips and 4 for the CIA with a comma. Next slide. This one, about the change of Tepedino's CI Havana contact, is just as easy. 8 spaces for Phillips and 14 again for his replacement, Arthur Avignon. Next slide. We'll go back to the end of the other FBI document. We can see that just below the bottom, the CI still wants to keep the comparison being made between two people a secret. Let's blow it up. Let's fill in the blanks to this crucial gem. It's exactly 39 spaces, and guess what amazingly fits in there? Dave Phillips was using Martin. Perfect. Let's go to the next one. In the same area of that document. This is another crucial gem with 2 holes containing 6 and 18 spaces respectively, discussing an identical physical description. Guess which names fit in there perfectly? Martin and Phillips. Next slide. This one too, about who contacted Cabela, Mexico City. It's child's play. 7 spaces for the space CIA. Next one. This one too. 1 hole for Phillips and 2 for the CIA. You can see as you look through here that Tepedino, who had been talking with the FBI about Phillips, is afraid that Phillips will be thinking he's working behind the CIA's back. Okay, next one. Now let's turn briefly to this JM wave cable and scroll down to the end of it. Next slide. Again, it tells us how close Phillips and Tepedino were. It also adds a new contact for Tepedino that Pancho will give him, the name Harvey Thompson. Next slide. Here's a CIA document that tells us a little more about this Harvey Thompson. Let's blow it up. Thompson is Phil Toomey, meeting with an Anti-Castro leader. Ferrari was his name. It's also not shown here, but it mentions Catherine Tafe, about whom, along with June Cobb, I might say something for a few minutes in a later session this afternoon. Next slide. This is an excerpt from the CIA Bay of Pigs history written by William Pfeiffer, and it tells us a lot more about Phil Toomey. He was a close associate of Phillips and was a political and psychological strategist, a PP staffer. Next slide. This is a bunch of pseudos for Phillips. We talked about Choaden. The one that's been protected so long is Merton. Knight appears in Hunt's books. Go to the next slide. We've got a bunch more here. Lawrence F. Barker pops up in Mexico City. So if you see Lawrence F. Barker, it's Phillips. It's easy to prove. Somebody asked me a question. Douglas, Miguel and Douglas, and Bob, Lee, and Roberto has a lot to do with when Phillips is running Conti Aguero, a television and radio personality in Cuba. And I don't have a slide for the rest of these. John D. Nadelman was used in Phillips' work with the PP Ops staff, the PP Information Coordinate Division, and cinema, radio, and TV. And possibly Neil T. Pickworth, first used to interview and assess AM Corps 2 for Conti Aguero. There's also a Donald Barton, who is Phillips' contact or a contact of Phillips related to the Conti Aguero case. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned the roadblock set in place to decouple Phillips from Merton. This is the cable in which it was inserted. Next slide. We're going to blow it up at the top. At the very top, it says that Choaden, a known pseudonym for Phillips, is negotiating with Merton. Because we know, I just showed you beyond the reasonable doubt, that Phillips is Merton, and that Merton cannot be negotiating with himself. What we now have is a very valuable example to exactly how compartmentalization is used inside the CIA at the secret level to fragment somebody who's playing multiple roles. Back to the main conference title sheet. Let's go back to the main one. Let me summarize this part of my presentation by posing this question. What's so crucial about the Phillips-Merton identification that it still remains classified today? Here are some points to consider. Eisenhower's policy in 57 and 58 was to replace both Batista in Cuba and Trujillo in the Dominican Republic with less corrupt and more moderate leaders, believe it or not. It was Phillips who chose to recruit the DR for this task in Cuba. Why? Because the DR was the most legitimate, historically rooted Cuban revolutionary group, and it was not subordinate to the Communist Party. It was Phillips and Tepedino who began the operation to defect and recruit Cabela the moment that Castro seized power. Without the knowledge that Phillips was Merton, a critical part of Phillips' role on the path to the darkest operation disappears. It is the Merton history that takes us from Cabela in Cuba to Oswald in Mexico City. After the Kennedy assassination, Phillips had to be disconnected from that history. I will end this part of my presentation with this observation. Phillips had to leave Cuba around January 1960. Jim Knoll, the Havana station chief, using the pseudo, by the way, Olean, needed someone who could handle the DR element that remained, Cabela, Pancho, and Carlos Tepedino. That someone is the subject of the remainder of my presentation. Back to the main. Well, you were already there, all right. Just leave it there. Previously, I mentioned the failure of Tepedino and his case officer Dave Phillips to defect Cabela in January 1959. When Phillips left Cuba at the end of that year, CIA Deputy Chief of Station Arthur Avignon took over Tepedino's case. Then, after Cabela and Tepedino attended a student conference in Switzerland in September 1960, his father called him and warned him never to come back to Cuba. So Tepedino came to the United States using his temporary student visa. Meanwhile, in May 1960, the remaining disaffected clandestine DR element inside Cuba sprang into action. They exposed themselves by openly attacking the visiting Soviet Vice Premier, Anastas Mikoyan. Afterward, they had no choice but to flee to Miami. There, they became the unilateral psychological warfare asset of the JM Wave Station. Okay, next one. No, not the conference slide. Next section, Jay. Okay, good. We're there. William Kent Dan Harvey mentioned him a minute ago, William W. Kent, also known as Robert K. Truchard, also known as Oliver H. Corbiston, also known as Douglas Gupton, reconstituted this DR remnant into the DRE. After working for Phillips's political and psychological branch of WH4 at headquarters, Kent was sent to the JM Wave Station in Miami to be the chief of the Wave Psychological Warfare Branch. Kent's subordinate, George Joannides, became the case officer for the DRE. The DRE, as you've already heard, ran a dark propaganda op right after the Kennedy assassination, suggesting that Oswald's murder of President Kennedy was part of a Castro plot. Next slide. William Kent managed the CIA's use through his DRE operations of Lee Harvey Oswald. You've heard this before, but I'm going to put it up there again. House Select Committee investigator Gaten Fonzie told Malcolm Blunt, I believe, about the conversation he'd had with the daughter of William Kent. William Kent's daughter told Fonzie that at a Thanksgiving gathering, her father made the one and only comment he ever did about the JFK assassination, and that's it. Oswald was a useful idiot. That's it. Next slide. Okay, we do some quick history here. During Tepedino's temporary stay in New York City, Kennedy defeated Nixon in the November 60 election, and in December, the United States and Canada broke relations, and the embassy and the CIA station in Havana closed. In order to secure a permanent visa, Tepedino had to first exit and then return to the U.S., so he spent the first half of March 1961 handling this in Mexico City. Cabela just so happened to be attending a conference in Mexico City at the same time. And Tepedino again made arrangements with Phillips to defect Cabela. The file pseudonym for these activities of Phillips was again Martin. This second Cabela defection attempt failed, and Cabela returned to Cuba. A month later, in April '61, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. And 3 months after that, a CIA stay-behind agent in Cuba failed in an attempt to exfiltrate Cabela. Several days later, on 16 June, that same CIA agent was himself successfully exfiltrated. His CIA cryptonym was A.M. Rye 1. I'll be laying out the cables and the facts that reveal who he was in this part of my presentation this morning. But meanwhile, Carlos Tepedino, frustrated by all the CIA's failures to defect and exfiltrate his good friend Cabela, dropped contact with the CIA and began giving his information to the FBI. At the end of 1961, the Kennedy brothers created a new committee and charged it with overthrowing Castro, and it developed a plan we know as Operation Mongoose. Structurally, it became Task Force W, headed by the CIA's Foreign Intelligence Staff Chief, William King Harvey, at CIA headquarters, with a Forward Operations Center at the JM Wave Station in Miami. In June 1962, Harvey asked JM Wave Chief Ted Shackley to develop a new plan to defect Rolando Cabela. Now, I am ready to take you through a close examination of this new effort to defect Cabela and the key events that followed in July and August 1962. In so doing, it's my intent to solve an old conundrum. What is the birth name? And what was the birthplace of the person who used the names Tony Sforza and Henry J. Sloman? Next slide. The solution, again, requires observing how seemingly different characters undergo identical life events. Do a search for one name in the Farrell Foundation and Narrow, you don't get it. You have to compare the life events and search against 2 or 3 to put them together. So more specifically, I'm going to ask you to try, as complicated as this might be, to do this. As we go through the next series of documents, please pay attention, close attention to how many characters experience the following 4 life events. Go ahead. Who hid in his home to avoid the Cuban police the night before the Bay of Pigs invasion? Who failed to exfiltrate Cabela from Cuba on 8 June 1961? Who was exfiltrated from Cuba on 16 June? And finally, who was the father of Carlos Tepedino. As I mentioned earlier, the CIA often uses deception in their secret cables and memoranda to backstop the fragmentation of one individual into multiple identities. You will see such deception take place in the JM Wave cables that I'm about to show you. These cables describe the new CIA effort to defect Cabela with the help of his best friend, Carlos Tepedino. The intentional deception that takes place in these wave cables was done to hide the true identity of Carlos's father. Now let's get to work laying the base for this part of the puzzle. Let's go to the next section slide, title slide. Good. I'm going to break up this part of the presentation into 4 sections. The new JM Wave defection plan, a surprise postcard from Cabela to Tepedino, pseudonyms, key events in Tepedino's dad, and finally solving the Sforza-Sloman puzzle. We will start, next subtitle sheet, with the CIA's renewed effort in 1962 to defect and recruit Cabela. In this section, we'll be dealing with just a single document, which is this one. Next slide. Wave 4746. The station's response to CIA headquarters. Let's blow some of it up. This cable references the headquarters cable, asking JM Wave to develop a possible Cabela defection op. Go to the next one. It shows us how Pancho wanted to play a major role in this op and how he tried to use his family connections to bolster his case to do so. Go to the next one. It gives us the jewelry business background, not just for Carlos, but for the Tepedinos, period. Next slide. It talks about the role of the childhood threesome in the DR. Next slide. Pancho talks about how great Tepedino's influence is over Cabela. It's the best way to get to it. But here is where we need to stop and slow down and take a close look here. It's important to pay attention to the fact that the author of this cable, not Pancho, is responsible for the following 2 statements about Henry Sloman. Like Pancho, Sloman works at the CIA JM Wave Station in Miami. You don't see the name Sforza on memos and cables. You see Henry Sloman. First of all, this wave cable states, quite innocently, it looks like, that Sloman knows Tepedino and his dad. Well, that statement would lead anyone reading it to believe that Sloman and Tepedino's dad are 2 different people. Second, this wave cable states that Sloman hid in Tepedino's dad's home. This statement further reinforces the impression that Tepedino's father and Sloman can't be the same person. There could be no mistake about the intent of this message. Henry Sloman is not Carlos's dad. Next one. And finally, Pancho, with the support of the JM Wave Station, offered to handle the pitch to bring Tepedino into the ongoing CI Cabela defection op. As we will see, this strategy immediately turned into an unanticipated debacle. Next section, Jay. Next section. It's really great to have somebody run the slides for you so I can focus on what I have to say to you and not fool with all that stuff. This section will deal with the surprise postcard from Cabela to Tepedino. Let's go to the next slide. It's wave 5457. We'll be working from this one, of this whole section. It tells the story of how the news of Cabela's postcard circulated and the events that took place immediately afterwards. Okay, let's blow up some of this stuff. All right, the Cabela postcard story at JM Wave began when Pancho heard about it from the surviving Echevarria family. Acting impetuously, egotistically, and authoritatively, Pancho ordered, rather than asked, Tepedino to call him about the postcard. Next slide. Carlos did make the call to Pancho. However, a big problem occurred when Carlos refused to give Pancho any details about the card. Pancho now had to figure out something to save the operation and still remain a part of it. So this time he politely asked Tepedino to call him back that evening. Next slide. When Carlos did call back again, he had not changed his mind. He still refused to give Pancho any details about Cabela's postcard. But the JM Wave Station had anticipated that this would occur and had arranged for Henry Sloman to be standing in the room during the second call. So at this point, Sloman took the phone away from Pancho to talk with Carlos. Next slide. So this wave cable gives us more details that are interesting, such as it was Tepedino's dad who failed to exfiltrate Kubela from Cuba in June 1961. But here again, we slow down and look very closely, because the author here, not Pancho, is making two more deceptive statements about Sloman. First, this wave cable tells us that Sloman was presented to Carlos using the alias Enrique, and that this alias was known by Tepedino's dad. So once again, the author of the wave cable is trying to reinforce the message that Sloman and Tepedino's father are two different people. Second, this wave cable states that Sloman hid in Tepedino's father's home. Look, over and over, these wave cables paint Sloman and Tepedino's father as different people. But we will soon see how the drafter of this wave cable made a crucial mistake. When we compare its exact details with the previous wave cable, we'll discover that the author of the second cable inadvertently gave us a crucial clue to the very thing being hidden, the identity of Carlos's father. I'll bring us back to that discovery at the end of this section. I want to finish wave 54, 57 first. Next slide, Jay. This wave cable tells us that the failed 61 exfiltration to Cuba, a failure ascribed to Tepedino's dad, was the reason that Carlos Tepedino finally went to the FBI for help. In the second phone call, however, Carlos's attitude towards Sloman was completely different than his distaste for Pancho. Carlos immediately told Sloman all the details of the postcard from Kubela. Next slide. It was then that Sloman told Carlos about the new CIA plan to defect Kubela, and Sloman asked Carlos for his help to pull it off. Go to the next one. Should be 16. Yeah. Carlos Tepedino not only agreed to do it, but also told Sloman that he would do anything to help Kubela. I have two asides to bring up here. First of all, this wave cable also further builds upon the evidence I was developing earlier. It states that Carlos Tepedino knows Merton by his true name, which we know is Dave Phillips. And the reason that the Tepedino-Merton association was brought up again in this later wave cable is to again facilitate the Harvey Thompson contact for Tepedino. Recall that Tepedino said he would trust any friend of Merton, and we know that Harvey Thompson is Phillips' associate, Toomey, the psychological strategist. Okay, now let's go to section 6. We will begin this section by resolving life event 1. Who was it that hid in his home, or hid in the home of Tepedino's dad? And solving it will open the door to the resolution of life event number 4, the identity of Carlos Tepedino's father. Next slide. As I indicated a moment ago, we need to go back to this one here. The first paragraph of wave 5457, let's blow it up. Remember that it tells us unequivocally that Tepedino's father hid in his own home. Now, next slide, let's compare it with the third paragraph of wave 4746. Blow it up. This cable tells us unequivocally that it was Sloman who hid in the home of Tepedino's father. Now you put two together and you get the crucial slip-up. Look, if Carlos's father hid in his own home, and Sloman's the one who hid in this home, then Sloman must be Carlos's father. In retrospect, it was the use of Pancho to get to Tepedino and Kubela that was the mistake. Carlos's lack of respect for Pancho made it necessary to bring in Sloman, and then to write about it in a cable made it very tricky language to do it and maintain that fragmentation. But the discovery we made there is reinforced in concrete in the next memorandum. Let's go to the next one. We are fortunate that as it finished its work, the Assassination Records Review Board released in full this copy of Pancho's June 1962 one-page biography of Carlos Tepedino, and they don't quote this in the wave cables. Let's go blow up the note at the bottom. In that note, Pancho completely gives away the secret being hidden in the two-wave cables. Henry Sloman is Tepedino's father, and he, Sloman, hid in his home during the days surrounding the Bay of Pigs invasion. No dancing in the end zone yet. The Henry J. Sloman name is only a pseudonym. We need more pieces of evidence to work with. And thanks to Pancho's huge ego, we can find them in the documentary record. Let's go to the next slide. So now we fast forward downstream. It's 1969. Jake Esterline has taken over the Miami station. He's using the name Anthony R. Pancho, by the way. If you've ever seen that Pancho pseudo, it's Esterline. He's got a huge mess on his hands made by Pancho and the Miami media by making accusations against someone he calls Frank. Next one. This Esterline memo gives us 3 huge clues about this Frank. First of all, Frank was Pancho's case officer. Second, Pancho was directed by Frank to introduce him as Frank Stevens, a professional gambler. Third, Frank is Enrique. Recall that Sloman was introduced to his son Carlos on the phone as Enrique. So where does this leave us? We know that Sloman, Frank Stevens, and Enrique are 3 pseudonyms for the same person who is Carlos Tepedino's father. We're not even remotely done yet. Next slide. We now need to look at this memo that the CIA special agent in charge, Kane, sent to Esterline after Esterline asked him to investigate the accusations made in the media by Pancho against Frank. Let's blow it up. From this Kane memo, we get another important piece of the puzzle. Pancho himself claimed responsibility for the June 61 exfiltration of Tepedino's dad, Frank. Next slide. Now let's check out a couple more sections real quick. Go back to the Esterline memo. Some more pieces in the puzzle. This one here, Esterline tells us that earlier, Emilio Rodriguez Americo had been Pancho's case officer and that it was Emilio who turned Pancho over to Frank in November 1960. I'll come back to Pancho's case officer history in my concluding remarks. By the way, Emilio is an important guy for a lot of other reasons. If it weren't for Malcolm Blunt, I probably wouldn't have gotten as far as I did on that. And Esterline confirms the June 61 exfiltration of Frank. This next slide. This is another section of the same Esterline memo. Let's blow it up. It gives us the rest of the story about the person hiding in his home or hiding in the home of Tepedino's father. Esterline's memo tells us that it was Frank Stevens who hid in his home. Furthermore, Esterline explains how Frank's gambling cover had served him well because it enabled his servants to convince the Cuban police that he was out of his house gambling the night before the Bay of Pigs invasion when he was actually hiding in his home. This hiding in the home story further cements the 3 pseudonyms, Frank Stevens, Enrique, and Henry Sloman, used by Carlos Tepedino's father. Next slide. At this point, I want to summarize the 3 key life events of Tepedino's dad. He hid in his home, 17 through 21 April 61. He failed to exfiltrate Cabela from Cuba circa 8 June. And his crypt is AMRI 1, and AMRI 1 was exfiltrated on 16 June 61. I've got a lot of documents on AMRI 1. I do not have the time to do that proof. So you can throw that one out or take it on faith. It'll be in my book, but I only have so much time today. Let's go to the next section, number 7. Okay, we're almost done. I have 2 remaining tasks. First, to prove that the above 3 aliases belong to Tony Sforza. And second, to reveal the birth name of the person using the name Sforza and his aliases and nicknames. Next slide. Let's go back to the Kane memo again. Blow it up. Kane states that Pancho said Jack Stewart, the pseudonym for Phillips I mentioned earlier, was his first contact during 1959 in Cuba. That's incorrect. Esterline actually said that Phillips recruited Pancho sometime during 1957, and we'll add that detail to my big net diagram at the end. Next slide. But the Kane memo also tells us 2 more things about this Frank Stevens that he learned from Pancho. Number 1, Frank was a CIA supervisor in the Cuban program at JM Wave. Number 2, Frank had earlier served in Argentina. Any clues for those out there? Those 2 details belong to Tony Sforza, who used the name Sarno in the church committee deposition. And that is Sforza's life event right there, those 2 things. As you can see, we're on the verge of adding Sforza into the mix of identities being used by a single individual who was Carlos's dad. We have another huge piece of evidence to buttress this. Let's go to the next one. I'm now ready to turn to a beautiful Kane memo that resulted from the same mess Pancho made in the media. But this one was sent to headquarters, where there was apparently some difficulty figuring out who Frank really was. Next. Here Kane gives away a crucial clue at the very center of the puzzle. The Frank referred to by Pancho was the subject of CIA headquarters file 53472. And guess what? Next slide. We got it. Task Force memo in 1962 about that. And it's a domestic alias documentation for 4 people. By the way, the name being withheld at the top of the list is Emilio. That's Emilio. Anyway, let's blow up the part we really need. The big news is that number that I just mentioned for Frank, 53472, clearly belongs to Tony Sforza. Now we have 4 names for Carlos Tepedino's father: Tony Sforza, Henry Sloman, Frank Stevens, and Enrique. Next slide. Now, if I can resort to the Wizard of Oz analogy, let's pull back the curtain to find the man in the control booth projecting all these names. We'll start with this CIA document about the 1965 polygraph of Carlos Tepedino. Blow it up. This CIA document tells us that Carlos Tepedino is an adopted name. It also tells us that his true name before the change was Carlos Ignacio Lopez. And note here that Lopez's new stepdad, when he adopts Carlos, he's not using the name Sforza. He's using his real name, Antonio Tepedino. We'll get to that. Anyway, let's blow up this handwritten note here, CIA handwritten notes on Tepedino's biological parents. And you will see mom is Amada Gonzalez, pop Ignacio Lopez. Let's go to the next document. This is from Tepedino's 1965 personal record questionnaire, and I made a composite out of that, and I'm going to blow up the parts that we really need to look at. Carlos's biological father, Ignacio Lopez, was born in 1900 in Havana, Cuba, and died in 1950. Carlos's adoptive father, and there's the name, Antonio Tepedino, it's actually Francesco Antonio Tepedino, was born not in Ohio, which is his cover story, 1900 in Salerno, Italy. In a moment, I'm going to show you from Ancestry.com the whole 4 or 5 generations of the Tepedinos in Salerno going back. But here we might interject this rhetorical question. Why is a man, I'm talking about Carlos, in his late 40s, who's married and has a daughter, getting a new stepfather anyway? All right, let's go to the next slide. To finish up here, I have one more document where the CIA uses the name stepfather, and it's that same trip I mentioned earlier, Cabela, going with Tepedino to the Switzerland conference. Go to the next slide. And it's the stepfather that makes the call, stepfather who makes the call, telling him not to come back to Cuba. All right, time to finish this puzzle. Let's go to the next section, Jay. And remember, you're going to have to... Good, just leave it. It's good. Yeah, just go. There we go. This is a net diagram that summarizes everything I just told you for the last few minutes. So I'm going to leave it there for a while. There's the name at the top, and there are the life events that pertain to him that some of his pseudos all experienced in one line right there across the middle: Sforza, Stevens, Enrique, and Sloman. The stepfather's relationship to Carlos Tepedino, and I can't really see the dates I have on there. I put that 1950, that's when that happens, and then the case officer status with Pancho, that happens in 1960. Underneath, you see the early recruitment of them all by Dave Phillips. So this little net diagram says a lot of things. I want to make some comments on it. I'll call him Fat, Francesco Antonio Tepedino. Fat was brought into Havana at the request of Chief of Station Jim Knoll in the fall of 1960. In his deposition to the Church Committee, using the alias Alfred Sarno, Francesco did not say exactly what the CIA chief of station wanted him to do, but I have an idea. There were 3 crucial reasons why Jim Noel wanted him for that Cuba assignment. First of all, someone was needed to fill in as the case officer for the DR leadership that Phillips had recruited in 1957. Second of all, the break with Cuba, the coming break, was only months away. So Noel needed someone, a new case officer, to come in without State Department cover. He would have to be deep undercover without, and function as a CIA station, stay-behind agent, not for station, a CIA stay-behind agent. That was his gambling cover. But what made Francesco Antonio Tepedino uniquely qualified for this role was that he had known Cabela for about 10 years, but also the most other important guy remaining, Carlos Tepedino, was his stepson. That's why Sforza was moved from Argentina. He was actually called Tony Argentina, left his family there and came back to run Tepedino and Cabela. Emilio Rodriguez was handling Pancho until Francesco arrived. Francesco assumed case officer status of Pancho November 1960. And it was just months earlier that the Anti-Castro DR remnant in Cuba had come out into the open, attacking McCoy, and had to flee. Francesco Antonio Tepedino arrives at JM Wave in June 61, and Pancho gets there eventually in March of 62, still under Francesco's case officer supervision. After the new Cabela op is underway, Joanides takes over as case officer for Pancho. Even though I have established that the true name behind all these names is actually Francesco Antonio Tepedino, I'm going to continue to refer to him as Sforza for everybody's sake in here. That's like a name that's not going to go away. So we'll just call him Sforza. Next slide, please. Just turn that clockwise. I've eliminated all the children here and just ran back through 5 generations. Last name's Tepedino. The first and middle name are always Francesco Antonio or Antonio Francesco, simply reversed every generation. The real son you see on the left, Antonio Tepedino, would have been Antonio Francesco Tepedino, died in a car accident in 1961 in New York, and that's in that Pancho bio of Tepedino. So Carlos is the stepson, the real son, in the same line of all those names, died, he was in the jewelry business too, up in New York, in a car accident. Next slide. You can pretty much read this for yourself. This is like bringing some of the data in off the Ancestry stuff and elsewhere of all these Tepedinos, including the son that died in New York in 61. They all come from Salerno, Italy. It was Francesco Antonio Tepedino's dad who actually immigrated to New York. And he had already been born in Salerno, but he arrives and they were American citizens. Next slide. If we get to it, as I said, in the Q&A, I'm willing to talk to you and show you some stuff, a little bit about the history of the PP staff, of the psychological warfare function from the time of the OSS up to the late 60s, involving, like I said, some of your very favorite characters in this case. Go back to the main conference. Title slide, please. Okay, leave it there. I begin my concluding remarks by returning to the CIA's methods of using pseudonyms and cryptonyms to compartmentalize covert ops. The agency's use of such methods is no longer a secret. The fragmentation of these dark operations and activities of CIA staff officers and contract agents 50 years ago is something we must defragment today. If in 1976 we had known Joanides was the man behind the pseudonym Walter D. Newby, the CIA would never have been able to get away with the outright perfidy of sneaking the fox into the henhouse. To wit, using the DRE case officer as the agency liaison to the House Select Committee. You heard a really totally fascinating presentation about that just now, this morning. To this very day, the CIA is still hiding the identities of its officers who ran the operation to recruit and steer Rolando Cabela into the plot to kill Fidel Castro. We need to identify them all. for in their midst, someone was running a more sinister operation under that one. Castro would be alive and appeared to be using Oswald to assassinate President Kennedy. So resolving these issues surrounding the CIA's multiple identities and pseudonyms helps us to piece together the true story of Oswald and the CIA, and this comes to something Jim Lazar and has been doing all this time, it enables us to make stronger cases for Freedom of Information Act filings. Having the facts and the crypts and the pseudos doesn't hurt us when you come before a judge and ask for files to be loosed. Let's go to the next slide, please. 4 decades ago, a CIA staff officer, George Giannides, handled the Directorate of Operations account for the agency's liaison. And as you've heard this morning, his role as a case officer for the DRE was a dark op, and it was withheld from the House Select Committee. But Giannides was a Greek staff officer working at the CIA JM Wave Station in Miami with this pseudonym, as Dan said, Walter the Anubi. He'd been the senior case officer in charge of the DIA operations at the time of their association with Oswald in New Orleans. And under Giannides' supervision, DRE launched its public campaign just hours after the president's death, designed to help link Oswald to a supposed Castro plot. That campaign was part and parcel of the darkest operation I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, to play the JFK-RFK plan to take out Castro back against his brother, the president and his brother. In the 2008 edition of my Oswald and the CIA, I wrote about Oswald's Mexico City trip and about Angleton's possible role in the counterintelligence part of this plot, placing the World War III virus into Oswald's files in an ingenious manner so as not to let it balloon up until the day of president's murder. It's a detailed plan, and it's not something I can break into detail here. I did that before, spent a lot of time in that edition of the book. In addition to tying Oswald to Castro, the Mexico City Oswald operation also implicated the KGB in the murder too, and Dave Phillips was heavily involved in several parts of this. In fact, Dan did such a good job talking about his movements back and forth, headquarters, JM Wave, and Mexico City at the crucial time of the communications. That's one thing he didn't mention, is the cables going back and forth between headquarters CI and the station, observing or thinking they're observing Oswald down there. And Phillips is all around. That's exactly when he's down at JM Wave. Those few days, that's when all this stuff goes back and forth. And the routing slips that are covering those things that we now have, which they would not show to the House Select Committee, okay, really help inform us about who at headquarters and at CI Ops, and names that we have now that the Records Review Board lifted the redactions on, that help us know some of the people who knew about what was going on. When we put all the pieces of this plot together, we can see how this dark operation in play underneath the top shell operations did more than achieve the death of JFK. It was a malevolent and diabolical psychological warfare plot, convincing Robert Kennedy he had just got his brother killed and set the stage for World War III. And in addition to that, terrorizing several august members of our government with the prospect that such a terrible event would befall the world unless they helped engineer a lone gunman cover-up. Next slide. Now I want to take an aside and address the possibility of a Giannides Part 2 story. See, Giannides may have been the case officer for another part of that same dark operation, and this part too was hidden from the House Select Committee. Remember that in June '62, headquarters asked Wave, told Wave they were interested in defecting Cabela again, and they attempted to use him in a plot to assassinate Fidel Castro. At Wave, it was Wilfredo Francisco Pancho Varona who identified Tepedino as the key to doing this, to get to Cabela. And it was at this decisive moment that Pancho's case officer, Tony Sforza, turned Pancho over to a Greek case officer who was working in the JM Wave station. The JM Wave station then used Pancho, Tepedino, and Tepedino's stepdad, Sforza, to set up the recruitment of Cabela. This Greek case officer handled Pancho for the next 3 years until the Cabela op was blown and he was arrested and tried in Cuba. One might be justified in marveling at just how many Greek case officers were running Cubans at JM Wave at the same time. The 1962 JM Wave Cabela Op was carried out in conjunction with Cabela's participation at the 8th World Festival of Youth and Students in Helsinki, Finland. One of Joe Aniti's fitness reports, the one in 1962, is really interesting. It indicates that he was the case officer for not one, but 2 different hemisphere-wide students and teachers' organizations engaged in political action, propaganda, and intelligence collection. 2. Among the items that Jim Lazar has put forward in the Blakey Hardway Lopez FOIA filing that just went down a couple of weeks ago, has been filed, is a request for the release of any CIA files that may help us determine if Joe Anides was in fact the Greek case officer involved in these activities. Next slide. Finally, let me close with this observation on the Warren Commission 50 years out. We began with a cover-up by the Warren Commission as Lyndon Johnson used the threat of World War III as a battering ram to create and use the commission. It was not a difficult endeavor. I believe it is no longer conjecture, but it is a fact that the World War III groundwork had already been cooked in the CIA's Oswald files before the assassination. 12 years later, the House Select Committee and other committees of Congress and the Senate have begun opening the door to the truth. Their collective works have helped confirm what most people have long suspected. The murder of President John F. Kennedy was a conspiracy, after all. The Warren Commission got it wrong. Oliver Stone's film JFK provoked the bipartisan passage of the JFK Records Act in the 1990s. And 4 million pages of assassination records were subsequently placed in the National Archives. Now we can read the transcripts and even listen to the phone conversations that reveal how Johnson cajoled Senator Russell to serve on the commission, and exactly how LBJ used the threat of World War III and 40 million dead Americans to force Chief Justice Earl Warren into doing what he had refused 3 times to do, twice to Robert Kennedy and the first time to Johnson, until confronted with that terrible threat, namely to head up the commission that bears his name today. 50 years after the publication of the Warren Commission report, it has become clear that it was not just wrong. The longer that we have to study the case, the wronger the Commission's findings become. In a nutshell, I'll put it that way: the longer, the wronger. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Ladies first.
All right. Hey, John, thank you for that. Very interesting. I'm dying to read the rest of the story there. I have a question, because you keep talking about Robert Kennedy being behind the Castro assassination plots. And I'm sure you've read Helm's testimony where he says he lied to Des Fitzgerald when he told him that he had Kennedy's approval when he actually didn't to approach Cabela. And I'm sure you've read the Castro IG report that's where the CIA asks itself, can we state that we had executive authority? And they answer their own question, not in this case regarding the plots, and they say we told RFK about the plots that had ended, but not the plots that are continuing. And then, of course, there's the word of Kennedy himself, because this came out during Robert Kennedy's time, and he's like, I'm the guy who turned off the operations. And Cy Hirsch reported that Adam Walensky had said, that Robert Kennedy had told him he got in writing something from the CIA that they would not kill Castro. So how does that fit in with what you're saying?
I believe that they weren't going to kill Castro. So I'm with you on that. But I think we could also cite a number of things that would indicate the reverse.
Why would the CIA admit in their own secret document that was 4 copies only, never supposed to be released, that did actually get pried out by the ARB, that wouldn't have been released otherwise, where the CIA says in its own, it's kind of like the kid with his hand in the cookie jar, and he says, oh, I didn't steal the cookie, but then he goes and writes in his diary, yeah, I stole the cookie. Which are you going to believe? The kid who says, I didn't steal it, or what he wrote in his diary?
Only that it makes eminent sense to convince Robert Kennedy that the plan he had been part of was what got his brother killed.
I get that, and
okay,
I agree that as a theory that works really well, but it works equally well if it just is out there to convince the public of that. Regardless, Robert Kennedy was shut down by his own grief. He didn't need.
I need to
be
make a
shut down.
couple of comments.
Okay.
First of all, while the Air Force One was still in the air, Hoover got on the phone and told RFK that they had the president's shooter. Oswald was his name, and he'd been to Cuba several times, but wouldn't tell us what he went there for. When you think about what's going through RFK's mind, and doesn't he go to somebody help me out, and say he was
His first call was to the CIA, the emergency CIA line. He basically said, "Did you guys kill my brother?" That was Kennedy's first call.
He said he was one of yours, Paulino.
That was later, yeah, where he said it was one of yours. But his first call was to the CIA. "Did you kill my brother?" Yeah.
Right, exactly. So also, if you think about this a little bit deeper, what is Desmond Fitzgerald doing with the poison pen?
And well, it's funny because David Phillips in his own book says it wasn't Desmond Fitzgerald who gave him the pen, it was actually the case officer. And he also says it didn't happen on November 22nd, said it happened on October 29th, and I just found the document that supports that.
What is the purpose of doing that in the first place? Why, if we don't want Castro to die?
Oh no, they want people to think that the Kennedys
I want you to play along with
Sorry.
it, just for a minute, Liz, just play along with it. You know, you got to put your other hat on here for a second. Mm-hmm. It would be because they want that in the record, that they wanted Castro dead.
They're hiding
the fact that there is actually another operation on the play which Castro cannot die. He's got to live.
Right.
So it makes perfect sense when you understand how this works to go give him a poison pen.
Right. No, I'm with you 100%.
Like there's a legitimate op for Cabela to kill Castro. And so that's the way you have to look at this.
I agree with 100% of everything you say, with the one exception that I don't believe from the record that RFK ever authorized such a plot, but the CIA needed to make it look like he had to fulfill their
and like
their
I said, I'll give you either way on this. We could talk for hours, and we're not going to. There's other people in the room here about that part. So if we agree on everything else, we're doing pretty good.
I agree on everything but that. So let's.
Paul,
and I think
go
it's
ahead.
important. I only think it's important because RFK is dead and he can't defend himself. So let's not accuse him without better evidence.
Paul?
Paul Kunstler, Dr. Newman, I've read one of your books. Lamar Waldron, in his book last year on the Kennedy assassination, reported that David Atlee Phillips recruited Vincent Bigliosi before he died to write his book, Reclaiming History. Reclaiming History is like Gerald Posner's book, Case Closed, is written for an elite audience, primarily journalists predisposed to believe the government's false version of events. Informed people in Europe and Asia have known for decades the truth about JFK assassination. Why do you think that we and thousands of others before us have not been able to break through here in the United States to bring the truth to the American people?
Well, one of the main reasons is what I was talking about today. If you can't identify the characters because they've been fragmented into hundreds of pieces, you can't put the story together. And it's not just done to confuse us. As I said, it was done internally. So it's very confusing even for people inside the CIA. One person can be at one desk, 3 desks down, does not know, does not have a need to know what that other guy is doing. Only the people at the staff level, who talked about the PP staff, talk about CI staff, talk about FI staff, those guys all go back to the OSS, almost all of them. They've been around. They're the only people who know what's going on and how the PP staff infiltrates the Director of Operations and runs its own ops underneath ops. And we have information. So until you can do that, you don't know the story. And we're just kind of lost in space trying to figure out who's doing what. So when you talk about shots in Dealey Plaza and doing that side of the case is one thing, but when you start talking about especially who in the CIA might have known before the fact or what they might have done as part of it is difficult to do until we get the Crips, the pseudos, and the nicknames and all that stuff in the open and in the clear. And we need more FOIA filings, and we need access to the documents to do it. The routing slips, stuff Malcolm Blunt's been talking about, all the internal distribution, those are the things we need. And without those things, that's the answer to your question. We're not going to be able to get very far.
Thank you.
Dan?
Dr. Newman, thank you very much. When we were working at the committee, I used to have a running argument with Bob Blakey. Bob insisted that we were looking for evidentiary proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and I would always argue that in order to understand the CIA or any possible CIA involvement in the assassination, we had to analyze it as an intelligence operation and use intelligence operation data and analysis to reach an operational level of decision, which may never really come to a proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That was what analysis technique that me and Ed tried to train ourselves to do in the short time that we had with the documents we had to work with. What I'm hearing you say today is, as an intelligence analyst, and I really appreciate your background in that, you think that you can go from the intelligence analysis level to actual proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Do you think that from a legal standard, the work that you're doing and the work that could be done at this point could actually rise to that level of not only probable cause, but being able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt an actual involvement of the agencies in a conspiracy?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're better qualified than I am. I'm not a lawyer, right? But that's the idea. Before a jury or before a judge is beyond the reasonable doubt. And notwithstanding your point, Lisa, maybe Robert Kennedy had nothing to do with it. I know of a lot of things too, and I just don't want to have a long conversation about that right now. That wasn't my point to come here today. But we must start with facts and then build that evidentiary base. And without that evidentiary base, you don't have beyond a reasonable doubt. You can't go there.
Jim?
But yeah, it gets back to the points that was made earlier by Dan Hardaway or by Professor Blakey.
So they can get it on tape.
Pull up the PP staff thing.
Yeah, I think it gets back to the point made earlier, that where you establish that someone under suspicion is lying, you have deprived him of credibility, so you can meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
We should thank Dr. Newman, and that's for sure, and we should recommend that there will be a panel discussion when we return. Jefferson Morley is presenting as close to 1:30 as possible. Thereafter, we will be joined by Dr. Newman and David Talbot by telephone, but we really should thank Dr. Newman very much and break for lunch.